Hey there guys, today we're going to be taking a look at every single Wolfenstein game running without a graphics card, and the way we're going to be doing that is by using this Beelink SER5 mini PC. Now this is rocking a RYZEN 5 5600H paired with 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 512 gigabyte SSD. So to start things off, we of course have to take a look at Wolfenstein 3D, the OG, and it's not actually the original. Wolfenstein was actually a franchise that dates back all the way to the Apple II and Commodore 64, though back then they were 2D games and they were made by a completely different studio. In fact, the reason that id actually made Wolfenstein 3D was that the guys at id Software were fans of the original series and the trademark had lapsed by the time that they had even conceived the idea of this game. So technically it's more of a spiritual successor to the original Wolfenstein games, but they do use the same name. But really, I don't need to show you any performance numbers here, considering that it is a DOS game. You're gonna be able to run this perfectly fine. But moving on to I think is now considered a almost forgotten classic. We have Return to Castle Wolfenstein, a personal favorite of mine. I remember playing this growing up as a kid and just being blown away by how this game looked and performed. It really is a extremely fun Wolfenstein game to play, and it was very nostalgic just to go through this. This and Medal of Honor Allied Assault are like ingrained in my mind as some of the classic first-person shooters that I played back in the day. And really, this is performing beautifully on here. We are reaching essentially the cap of what the engine will go to, but in general, we're getting a rock-solid experience with the full graphics settings. Now, it should be no surprise to anybody that this is going to perform this well, but it is very nice and fun to see a game that I grew up playing running so well on a system without even a graphics card, running it at the maximum settings at a resolution that was even higher than what I originally played this on. It is interesting to see it so HD in comparison to how it was when I was growing up. So it was fun to revisit this. Of course, you are again reaching the maximum capability of the engine. This is actually an engine limit here where it caps out at 90, which fun fact is also why a lot of the older Call of Duty games cap out at 90 as well, because they were based off of the original engine used in this game. That's why games like Call of Duty 4 just cap out at 90 FPS. But let's move on to the more modern interpretations. Now we have Wolfenstein: The New Order, which originally released in 2014, and it was what essentially started the soft reboot series that we know of now. Now it's actually a soft sequel to the 2009 version of Wolfenstein that was made by Raven Soft and published by Activision. Unfortunately, that version was delisted off of Steam, and there is no real legitimate way of getting a copy of it if you didn't already own it, which unfortunately I did not. If you're so inclined, you can sail the high seas to get yourself a copy of the game, but being that I have not really been in that scene for a while, I didn't really want to risk downloading anything from any less than reputable source. I may look into it later at some point, but as it stands, it really is one of those things where since you can't really get your hands on it today, at least not in an easy way, I don't mind omitting it from this list. That being said, Wolfenstein: The New Order does end up just going down its own story path, and it really is only loosely connected. But it is a really fun game, but it did have some issues. Specifically, a real annoyance is the fact that it has a 60 FPS cap. Now, you can modify files to actually uncap it, but it is one of those situations where you do introduce some performance issues, and there are certain situations where you can actually soft lock yourself in the game until you actually bring the FPS back to where it's supposed to be. In general, games that end up capping the FPS, I tend to just not mess with anymore, just because of the fact that you never know when it's actually going to end up leading to problems. So while it's annoying, it's not something that I'm willing to actually go through the effort of changing. Overall, the level of performance that we're getting here though is pretty decent. We are running this at the medium graphics settings, and the game does look visually very nice, and it performs decently enough. The 1% lows are at a range where it's perfectly acceptable. You're going to be able to play through this perfectly fine, and you're going to be able to have a great time. So in general, I consider this one a win and an absolute blast. This is a series that carries a time-honored tradition in gaming of just killing hordes of Nazis. A classic and a mainstay in gaming, something that I think all of us can get behind. Now, if we move on to the standalone expansion for it, Wolfenstein: The Old Blood, you can see here that it performs very similar to the previous game, also still carrying with it that 60 FPS cap. In general, the 1% lows are at a more than acceptable range, and really, in general, it is a fun experience, and we are also running it at the medium medium in-game graphics settings. It is unfortunate that these games run on OpenGL, so we can't use anything like DXVK since you need DirectX for that to work. Currently, I'm not aware of any converters that let you translate OpenGL over to Vulkan. Perhaps that would be enough to get our 1% lows to be absolutely locked at 60, but really you're not going to have anything to complain about with a 1% low of 52. In general, the game is going to be perfectly playable on here, and you should be having a fantastic time. Now moving on to Wolfenstein II, the New Colossus. Here we have the game running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, but we are at the full 1080p resolution. And in general, the level of performance that we're getting here is noticeably worse than the previous games, but not by a significant margin. The FPS is going to fluctuate a lot, but you're never really going to be dipping below 30, and your average is still going to remain consistent throughout the vast majority of the experience. It really was enjoyable to actually play the game like this, and thankfully we don't actually have to drop the resolution or anything like that to get a playable experience. There will be the occasional moment where you might feel a stutter here or there, but it isn't really going to be anything to drag down the overall experience. If you pay attention to those frame times, they are extremely consistent. There aren't any major spikes or anything like that, which means that the overall gameplay is going to feel extremely smooth, and it is going to be very enjoyable. I think if you turn off the FPS counter, you just don't pay attention to that and just focus in on the game, you're going to have a lot of fun here. And so far, this whole franchise has been doing pretty well on here, and I'm really impressed. And lastly, we do have Wolfenstein Youngblood, which is the most recent in the series. Here you're looking at it running with the lowest in-game graphics settings at the full 1080p resolution, and we're getting a little bit worse performance than what we were in the New Colossus, but not really drastically worse. In general, you can get away with playing like this. It is going to be a very enjoyable experience, and it is one of those things where I think if you're going to turn off the FPS counter, you're really not going to have too much to complain about, but we do see the lowest 1% lows that we've seen so far. There are some pretty noticeable dips here and there depending on how intense the action ends up getting and how many enemies are on the screen and just how chaotic things end up getting. It being a co-op enabled game does mean that if you're playing with a friend and things are getting really hectic, things might start to drop, but I don't think it ever gets to the point where it ruins the overall experience. If you do want to guarantee the absolute smoothest experience while playing on here, you can of course drop things down to 720p to make sure that your 1% lows never even get close to the 30 range, but you never quite get to 60. The gains at 720p aren't drastic enough that I would say that it is pretty much required over 1080p, but it really does depend on what exactly you're doing. There's going to be certain maps that you get onto where 1080p is really going to feel like a chore, and in those situations I really recommend that you just drop things down to 720p, but in general there is a lot of fun to be had here. And overall, I'm very impressed with this franchise. id Software has always been masters at creating an engine that is very accessible while also looking beautifully, and this series really carries that legacy with them. There are certain limitations in some of the games that I do find a bit annoying, specifically having these hard-coded in FPS caps that thankfully by this game in the series were completely removed, but they aren't to a level or anything that ruins the overall experience, and especially since we're running this on a system without a graphics card, it's not really that big of a deal. And in general, we have a very fun experience here. So this is a franchise that I think that you are going to be able to comfortably play on a system like this, and I really recommend you do it, especially the old ones. If you're looking to play specifically Return to Castle Wolfenstein, if you've never played that before and you're interested in trying some more classic first-person shooters, I say go for it. It really is a lot of fun, and if you have the Game Pass, you do actually gain access to pretty much all of these different games. They're going to be well worth your time. There's a lot of gameplay in this franchise, and you're going to be able to have an absolute blast. And even though Youngblood is my least favorite of the franchise, there's still a lot of fun to be had in it, and the fact that you can play this series perfectly fine on a mini PC like this without a graphics card is really impressive, especially since we really didn't have to drop the resolution on any of them. You can of course drop the resolution on Youngblood if you want to maximize your overall performance, but it's not necessary. But anyways, I hope you guys found this look at the Wolfenstein series running on the Beelink SER5 mini PC to be interesting, useful, or entertaining. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will catch you guys in the next one.